Hello 56T, my name's Alice. I am a web writer out at La Trobe University in Bundoora, and in my spare time I write poetry and occasionally I manage to get them published. So I wanted to talk to you guys today about how I do my writing and just give you some tips.
So Alice, would you like to perhaps read us the poem that you have brought along to share?
Okay, no worries. So this is a poem that I wrote about a year ago now, and it's called Departures. I don't want to go, he chokes out in new English, between flight numbers, brooding on the airport view. 8 hours till we land, more time to consider how he'd rather trade home for the girl in the surf shop on that beach just south of Cairns. So that's just a short little poem that I wrote. I got the idea for that when I was actually in an airport waiting to fly to Japan, and I heard a young guy on the phone to, I guess it was probably his host family, just saying, "I don't want to go home," and I sort of thought, "Oh, that's pretty sad."
So is that the first stage of writing for you? We call it planting the seed, but listening, looking and getting ideas from the world around you?
Yeah, I always carry a notebook with me because ideas can kind of come from anywhere. So whenever something interesting happens, I hear an interesting something that somebody says, or I see something interesting, I try and write it down as often as possible, and then I can come back to that notebook whenever I'm short of ideas and pick up something from there. And I just recently started keeping a notebook beside my bed as well, just in case I come up with something when I'm about to fall asleep.
That's good, because that often happens. And so once you've got a seed planted, like the idea of this guy leaving Australia, as it turns out to be, and going back home, what do you do next?
Well, probably the next stage for me would be to brainstorm as many ideas around that as possible. And when I'm brainstorming or drafting, I just try to write whatever comes into my head without worrying too much about what it sounds like. So this is when you're really gathering all your ideas together, or sort of free writing.
So do you worry too much there about your spelling and your grammar and things like that?
No, just basically scribbling stuff down as soon as it comes into my head, and you can come up with some really great stuff there as long as you're not too critical.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. And so after you've planted the seed, you've thought about what format it's going to take. Is it going to be a poem? Is it going to be an explanation text? Is it going to be a narrative? Whatever it is, and then you've started drafting it. What do you do after you've completed? We might call it our first draft. What do you do next?
Well, I think at that stage it's important to look at it and think, how is this piece going to work best? What can I do to make it into its best possible form? So in this case, I had a draft and I was really quite unhappy with it.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, it's about a Japanese guy. Maybe I can use some of the Japanese poetry forms to make it a bit better. And so what I've ended up with here is a Japanese poem form called the choka, which is like a haiku, but a little bit longer. So each line has either 5 or 7 syllables, and I found that as soon as I picked that form, it was just a lot easier to write something that was a lot tighter and sounded a lot better.
So you didn't just throw it out because you weren't happy with it? You kept it and looked at a different style when you were drafting? Yeah,
that's right. No, I keep everything because I'm afraid of losing. You might come back to it even a year later and it might be actually quite useful for something else. So if I'm going to delete something out of a Word file or something, I'll move it into a different file that I just call scrap, and revisit that later. But because the poem I've ended up with here is a lot shorter than what I had before, I've obviously cut out quite a bit, but it still exists somewhere.
That's good.
Yeah.
So after you've drafted, we go to the next phase that we call it, if you like, is the revising phase. So what do you do when you're revising a piece?
Well, with this one, I was writing it with for a poetry group that I was involved with. And so I sent it out to the other members of the group and got their feedback and listened to what worked and what didn't work. There are a few things that they thought could be better. So I tried not to get too upset about that, but just take that on board, and changed around a few words and tried to think about it from the point of view of a reader. Think about what I would enjoy reading. So I made a few changes and ended up with something which I think was a bit better than it was before.
You're starting to be happy with that.
Yeah.
And then I guess that kind of ties in with this rewriting phase. So you got your feedback, and then in the rewriting phase, just like you said, you took away some words, I think, and you put in some new words that you thought might be better.
Yeah, and that was when I really had to start focusing in on every single word, and even the punctuation. I had to start thinking about, where do I put quote marks? Am I going to use a dash? And because at the end of the poem, I had this reference to a beach just south of Cairns, I had to double check that there was a beach south of Cairns that I could be referring to. So I had to really look at each line very closely and think, okay, from a reader's point of view, does that make sense? Is it correct grammatically? Is the punctuation correct? And is it 100% ready to go?
Yeah, and I like that idea of checking your facts, because particularly if you might not be writing a poem, you might be writing a piece like I know the class are at the moment on persuasive texts. You need to reference all your facts and make sure that they're all ready to go. So that's a good point to do it in the rewriting phase.
Definitely.
And then we come to the publishing phase. And this is really interesting for the class to hear, how do you get published in the real world, and what actually happens?
Right. Well, with poetry, we're quite lucky in Australia. There's a lot of opportunities for poets. Really, it's just about... I joined the Australian Poetry Society, and they tell you about all the opportunities that are coming up, and every time there's a new publication looking for new poems, I always make sure that I check exactly what they want in their submissions, make sure that what I'm sending is as close to that as possible, and again, just triple checking that the poem is, looking really good and ready to go. And then send it off, and sometimes it comes through and sometimes it doesn't. If my poem does get rejected, I don't take that as a huge problem. I just think, okay, well, that's one that I might be able to use for a different publication sometime in the future, and I might be able to look at it again with fresh eyes and say, oh, I can see why they didn't take this one, because actually, it's not 100% ready yet. So that can be really useful, actually, to get rejected sometimes. But it's also really nice to get published.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And this poem, you were saying you've just submitted it to be published?
Yeah, this one is still in the submission phase, so just waiting to hear what happens there.
Good luck.
Thanks.
Well, thanks for talking to us about how you go about writing, because it's really important for us to know the different stages and how we can use them. But just to finish off, do you have any advice for any aspiring writers in the class, anybody that might want to be published in a poetry book, or perhaps have their own novel one day or something like that?
Yeah, well, I have a quote up in my little study from one writer that I admire that says, all the practice you get makes you better. So every time you write, you're going to be writing something a little bit better than you did yesterday. It's important not to think, I'm no good, I shouldn't write.
Yeah.
Every time you write, you are going to be improving. So what I try to do, I don't always get there, is to write every single day, write something, so that I know that every day I'm making a little bit of progress.
Do you think it's fair to say, for those people in the class that might think they can't write, is there such a thing, or can everybody write?
Yeah, no, I think everyone can write. I don't think that it's, yes or no. I think, it's just a matter of practice. I mean, it's like something like basketball. Maybe some people are a bit taller and they have a bit of an advantage, but it doesn't mean that you couldn't get really good at basketball if you just practice every day.
Yeah.
So.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Thank you so much for interviewing, being interviewed rather. And I know that 56T wish you all the best in getting that poem published.
Thank you. Thanks, 56T. See you later.